The office of Blackwell Industries was alive with the usual buzz of computers, ringing phones, and hurried footsteps. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, reflecting off polished floors that gleamed like mirrors. Among the busy employees moving from desk to desk, one man moved silently, his broom gliding across the floor with a quiet precision. He was the janitor, a quiet figure in a navy uniform, who seemed almost invisible in the chaos of the corporate world. His name was Samuel, though no one in the office thought much about him. To most, he was just the man who kept the floors clean. Today, however, the office was not just busy, it was tense. The CEO, Mr. Richard Blackwell, a tall man with a commanding presence and a sharp, calculating look, was inspecting the floor personally. He had a reputation for being ruthless, a man whose word could make or break careers. His expensive suit pressed perfectly against his frame, he walked past rows of employees with an air of superiority, his gaze like a spotlight, searching for mistakes. When his eyes landed on Samuel, something about the quiet janitor seemed to bother him. Perhaps it was the calmness in Samuel's face while the office flurried around him, a serenity that contrasted sharply with the CEO's own frantic energy. Mr. Blackwell stopped and raised an eyebrow, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Ah, the janitor," he said loudly, his voice dripping with mockery. "Still sweeping floors like a child pretending to work?" Samuel looked up briefly, a polite smile touching his lips, but he said nothing. He continued his work, sweeping carefully around the corners, avoiding any obstacle in his path. His silence, instead of pleasing the CEO, seemed to ignite his irritation even further. "Tell me," Mr. Blackwell continued, loud enough for several employees to hear, "do you ever plan to actually do something useful? Or is your entire career just mopping up after everyone else?" He chuckled, and a few nearby employees tried to suppress their laughter, not daring to meet his gaze directly. Samuel's hands paused for a fraction of a second, but he kept moving, his calm demeanor unshaken. There was something about him, a quiet strength that seemed to hum beneath the surface, something that the CEO could not understand or control. Richard stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the floor. "I don't understand why you're even here. I mean, this office is for thinkers, for leaders, for people who make money, not," he waved dismissively at Samuel, "for janitors who think sweeping is enough of a life." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Even the phones seemed to pause their ringing. Samuel looked up again, his eyes meeting the CEO's briefly. There was no fear in them. Only a calm, almost unreadable presence, a stillness that seemed to challenge the arrogance towering in front of him. The CEO, unsettled by the lack of reaction, felt a flicker of irritation mixed with curiosity. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Richard barked, leaning slightly forward. His voice carried the weight of authority, but there was a tension beneath it, a tiny crack in the mask of control he wore so confidently. Samuel finally spoke, his voice soft but clear. "I am doing my job, sir. Just as you are doing yours." There was no disrespect in his tone, only truth. For a moment, Richard blinked, caught off guard. The room held its breath. Employees exchanged glances, some felt a spark of admiration for the janitor, while others feared what would happen next. The CEO, who was used to instant obedience and fear, felt an unfamiliar sense of uncertainty. He had mocked countless employees before, broken spirits, and yet this man, a janitor, did not seem broken at all. Richard laughed, a sharp, almost cruel sound. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" he demanded. "I am the man who runs this company. I make the decisions, I call the shots, and yet here you are, speaking to me as if we are equals." Samuel paused for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Yes, sir. I know who you are. That's why I do my work properly." A murmur ran through the room. The simplicity of the statement, the quiet confidence behind it, made it more powerful than any words of argument or defiance. Richard's lips tightened. There was something unsettling about Samuel, not loud, not aggressive, but there. A sense of hidden depth, a calm intelligence that refused to be intimidated. Richard turned away abruptly, signaling that the conversation was over, but his mind did not follow. He walked toward his office, muttering under his breath, but he kept glancing back. The janitor's presence lingered in his mind, a puzzle he could not solve. Meanwhile, Samuel resumed his work as if nothing had happened, sweeping the floors with the same meticulous care, unbothered by the mockery he had endured. Employees watched in silence, some feeling ashamed of their own earlier amusement. There was a new energy in the room, a quiet tension that made everyone a little more aware of the janitor they had ignored for so long. Something about him demanded attention, even without words, even without drama. He was invisible to most, yet somehow, he had become the center of the CEO's thoughts. As the day moved on, whispers traveled through the office. Did you see the way he spoke to the CEO? He didn't even flinch. Who is he, really? The air was thick with curiosity, a sense that something extraordinary was hidden behind the calm eyes of the man everyone had underestimated. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the polished floors, the CEO sat in his office, staring out at the janitor still working quietly. There was an unease he could not explain, a feeling that the simple man, who seemed so ordinary, held secrets that could change everything he thought he knew about his world. The next morning, the office was alive with the usual rhythm of keyboards, phones, and hurried footsteps. But there was an unusual tension in the air. Everyone seemed to be watching Samuel, the janitor, a little more closely than before. The CEO, Richard Blackwell, arrived earlier than usual, his sharp eyes scanning the office as if searching for some invisible clue. Samuel, as always, moved quietly, pushing his mop carefully, his presence calm and unassuming. Richard had spent the night thinking about the janitor. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. The way Samuel had responded to his mocking words, calm, polite, yet unshakable, was unlike anyone Richard had ever encountered. A part of him, buried deep under pride and arrogance, felt uneasy. He decided to test him, to see what the janitor was really capable of. By mid-morning, the office had received a surprise visit from international clients who needed urgent help. They were important, wealthy, and notoriously difficult, speaking multiple languages. Richard felt a sudden surge of panic as he realized he was expected to communicate flawlessly with them. His usual confidence wavered. Employees tried to hide their concern, whispering among themselves, while Richard's eyes darted nervously around the room. Samuel noticed the tension. He continued working, quietly observing everything. His movements were smooth, practiced, almost meditative. No one knew that he understood more than just cleaning. He had spent years quietly learning languages, reading books in different tongues while working odd jobs to survive. It was a secret life, hidden behind a simple uniform. The clients approached Richard, speaking rapidly in a mix of French, Spanish, and Mandarin. Richard's face turned red with embarrassment as he struggled to keep up. He fumbled with papers, stammered through sentences, and felt sweat forming on his forehead. The employees watched silently, some biting their lips to hide amusement, others silently praying for a miracle. Samuel stepped forward slowly, almost hesitantly. "Sir," he said softly, "I think I can help." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the janitor. Richard looked at him, confusion mixed with disbelief on his face. "Help," he repeated sharply. "You?" He couldn't imagine how a janitor could assist with such an important matter. "Yes, sir," Samuel replied calmly. "I know their languages. I can translate." Richard felt a mix of doubt, irritation, and curiosity. But with no other options, he nodded reluctantly. "Do it," he muttered, his voice tight with tension. As Samuel spoke, the room seemed to hold its breath. He switched seamlessly between languages, his words precise, polite, and fluent. The clients' eyes widened in surprise, smiles appearing on their faces as they realized someone understood them perfectly. Richard's jaw dropped. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. The janitor, whom he had mocked only the day before, was not only competent, he was extraordinary. Employees whispered among themselves, astonished. Some of them had known Samuel for years, sweeping past him every day without ever imagining this hidden talent. Now, in this moment, his true abilities were shining for all to see. Richard felt a strange emotion stirring in him. Pride? Admiration? Or was it guilt? He had dismissed this man as unimportant, yet here he was, saving the company from potential embarrassment in front of high-profile clients. The CEO's usual confidence faltered. For the first time in his career, he felt small, unsure, and powerless in the face of someone he had underestimated. The meeting ended successfully, thanks entirely to Samuel's intervention. The clients left impressed, shaking hands and expressing their gratitude. Employees clapped quietly, careful not to overstep, while Richard remained seated, staring at Samuel with a mixture of shock and awe. After the clients left, Richard finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "Samuel, how did you?" Samuel smiled faintly, brushing off the compliment. "I've always tried to do my best, sir," he said simply. There was no boastfulness, only quiet dignity. Richard looked away, trying to mask the swirl of emotions inside him. He had been proven wrong, humbled by someone he had thought was insignificant. And yet, there was something magnetic about Samuel, a calm strength that demanded respect without ever asking for it. Employees returned to their tasks, but the mood of the office had shifted. The janitor was no longer invisible. He had become the quiet hero of the day, and everyone knew it. Richard, too, could not stop thinking about him. He had mocked him, underestimated him, yet Samuel had quietly shown the power of hidden talent. As Samuel continued sweeping, the office buzzed around him, unaware that history had just been rewritten. The CEO had learned, in a moment of truth, that appearances could be deceiving, and that sometimes, the most extraordinary people were the ones you least expected. That day, a seed of curiosity and respect had been planted, one that would grow slowly, quietly, and change the lives of everyone in the office forever. And deep inside Samuel, there was a quiet smile, not of pride, but of knowing the world was beginning to see what he had always known about himself. The office seemed quieter than usual that afternoon, though the hum of computers and soft chatter never stopped completely. Employees glanced at Samuel from time to time, careful not to stare too obviously, but curiosity sparkled in every eye. The janitor moved with his usual calm, pushing his mop slowly across the floor, yet today there was a different energy in the room. It was almost as if everyone knew something extraordinary had just happened, and they were waiting to see what would come next. Richard Blackwell, the CEO, sat in his office behind the enormous glass wall that separated him from the bustling workspace. He stared at Samuel as if trying to decode a puzzle he couldn't solve. How could a man he had mocked, dismissed, and ignored be the one who saved an important meeting? His pride was bruised, and yet there was a growing feeling inside him, admiration mixed with disbelief. Just then, a sudden call came from the international clients who had visited earlier. There was an urgent issue that needed immediate clarification, and they were speaking in multiple languages again. Richard felt a spike of panic. He fumbled through papers, trying to prepare, but he knew he couldn't handle this alone. His eyes involuntarily went to Samuel. "Samuel," he called, his voice sharper than usual, "I need your help again. Are you able to assist?" There was a strange hesitation in his tone, as if he himself couldn't believe he was asking. Samuel paused, then nodded calmly. "Yes, sir. I can handle it." There was no boastfulness, only quiet confidence. His voice carried a sense of ease that contrasted with the CEO's tension. Employees crowded discreetly around, watching the exchange. Some held their breath, sensing that something remarkable was about to unfold. Samuel walked to the conference area where the call was happening. As he began speaking, the room seemed to shrink around him. He switched seamlessly between French, Spanish, Mandarin, and German, then to Arabic and Italian, the words flowing naturally from his lips. The clients were visibly stunned, their eyes widening, smiles forming as they realized that someone was truly understanding them. Richard's jaw dropped. His hands, resting on the desk, tightened into fists as he struggled to process what was happening. He had never seen such skill in any employee, let alone someone who had been sweeping the floors just hours earlier. The disbelief was written across his face, but beneath it, a small flicker of respect began to grow. The employees whispered among themselves, astonished by the display. They had always thought Samuel was just the quiet janitor who did his work diligently but had never imagined this depth of talent. Now, in real time, he was performing a feat that left everyone speechless. The CEO, known for his sharp judgments, sat frozen, unable to speak, as the janitor handled the entire situation with grace and professionalism. After the call ended successfully, Samuel returned to his mop and bucket as if nothing unusual had happened. There was no fanfare, no celebration. Just the same calm, steady presence that had always been his hallmark. Yet the office had changed in subtle ways. Eyes followed him, conversations paused when he walked by, and whispers filled the air. "Did you see that? He speaks like a genius. How did we never know?" Richard finally spoke, his voice low and tense. "Samuel, how is this possible? How do you know all these languages?" Samuel smiled faintly, brushing off the compliment. "I've always tried to learn, sir. It takes time, practice, and patience." His answer was simple, but it carried a quiet power. It wasn't arrogance, it was humility combined with knowledge. The CEO's mind raced. He had always believed that intelligence and talent could be measured by degrees, resumes, or office titles. Samuel had proven him wrong. A man who had been invisible to him, ignored, and mocked had just demonstrated abilities far beyond what Richard had ever imagined. As the day ended, Richard stayed in his office longer than usual, thinking about Samuel. The initial shock had turned into curiosity, then awe, and finally into a mix of guilt and admiration. How could he have been so blind? How could he have dismissed someone so capable? He realized that the janitor was more than just a helper, he was a man with knowledge, patience, and extraordinary skill, hidden in plain sight. Meanwhile, Samuel continued his routine, silent and humble. No one could guess the depth of his experience or the life he had lived before working as a janitor. His calm presence had left an impression not only on the CEO but also on every employee who had witnessed the extraordinary display of talent. It was a lesson quietly delivered: never judge someone by their position, appearance, or the simplicity of their work. And as the lights in the office dimmed, casting long shadows on the polished floors, there was a sense of anticipation lingering in the air. Everyone knew this was only the beginning. Samuel's story was far from ordinary, and the days to come would reveal just how extraordinary he truly was. The following morning, the office was unusually quiet. Even the hum of computers seemed softer, almost respectful, as if the building itself sensed the tension that had settled among the employees. Everyone knew something extraordinary had occurred, yet no one could put it into words. Samuel, the janitor, moved steadily through the hallways, pushing his mop and bucket with his usual calm. But today, the eyes following him were different. They were filled with curiosity, astonishment, and a growing sense of admiration. Richard Blackwell, the CEO, arrived early, his usual confident stride replaced with a hesitant pace. He couldn't shake the memory of Samuel switching languages flawlessly, handling international clients as if it were the simplest task in the world. Pride battled with disbelief in his chest. He had mocked this man, dismissed him, and yet, here he was, performing feats that Richard had never imagined possible from anyone in his office, let alone a janitor. A sudden problem arose that morning. A visiting delegation from Europe needed urgent translation for a series of business proposals. The CEO tried to step in, attempting to manage the situation, but the languages and the complex details overwhelmed him almost instantly. His nerves tightened, and employees could see the panic flicker across his usually unshakable face. Samuel noticed the rising tension and moved quietly toward the conference room. Without hesitation, he offered his assistance again. "Sir, I can help them," he said softly, his calm tone cutting through the anxiety in the room. Richard hesitated, his mind whirling. He had seen Samuel's abilities before, but this was more than just skill, it was mastery. Reluctantly, he nodded. Do it, he said, his voice low and tense. As Samuel began speaking, the atmosphere changed. Words flowed from him effortlessly: French, Spanish, German, and Italian. He understood the nuances of each language, switching seamlessly without a hint of hesitation. The European delegation looked at him in disbelief, their initial irritation and frustration replaced by astonished smiles. They spoke to him directly, expecting confusion, and instead found a man who understood every word. Richard watched, his jaw tight, unable to tear his eyes away. The quiet janitor he had mocked, ignored, and underestimated had turned the situation around completely. Employees whispered in amazement. "How is this possible? He's incredible. Why didn't we know before?" The meeting ended successfully. The clients left impressed, their praises echoing through the office. Employees clapped quietly, careful not to seem too obvious, while Richard remained seated, a storm of emotions brewing inside him. Shock, awe, guilt, and a tiny spark of admiration, he felt them all at once. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "Samuel, how do you do this?" Samuel smiled faintly, brushing off the praise. "I've always worked hard to learn, sir. I never thought it would matter so much." His humility made the impact of his words even stronger. There was no arrogance, only quiet strength. Richard felt a weight settle in his chest. He had underestimated him, dismissed him, and mocked him publicly. And yet, here was Samuel, proving that true talent could exist in anyone, no matter how ordinary they appeared. Throughout the day, the office energy shifted. Samuel moved quietly, humbly completing his work, but his presence carried a new weight. Employees no longer saw him as just the janitor, they saw someone extraordinary hiding in plain sight. And Richard, for the first time in his career, felt humbled, not by a business rival, but by a man he had ignored for years. As the evening approached, the sun casting golden light through the glass windows, Richard stood by his office window, looking out at Samuel quietly working. A lesson had been delivered without any grand speeches, without fanfare, just skill, humility, and quiet excellence. The CEO realized that talent could not be judged by position, appearance, or role. And deep down, he knew his life, and the office, would never be the same again. The office was quiet the next morning, but it was a different kind of quiet, one filled with curiosity and reflection. Samuel moved through the hallways with his usual calm, mop in hand, but the whispers of the employees followed him like a soft echo. Who is he really? Where did he learn all those languages? No one could stop thinking about the extraordinary talent hidden behind his humble appearance. Richard Blackwell, the CEO, was pacing in his office, unable to focus on anything else. The memory of Samuel switching between French, Spanish, Mandarin, and German replayed in his mind like a movie. He had mocked the janitor, dismissed him, and yet here he was, proving that appearances could be deceiving. Richard realized he had been blind, judging someone by their role rather than their character or potential. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to learn more about Samuel. He requested a private meeting, unsure what he would discover. Samuel arrived quietly, nodding politely, his calm presence filling the room. "Sir, how can I help you?" he asked softly. Richard took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "Samuel, I need to understand something. You speak so many languages. How did you learn all this? Where did this talent come from?" Samuel paused, a shadow passing over his calm face. "It wasn't easy, sir," he began. "I didn't always have a proper life. When I was young, I had very little. I had to work jobs that didn't pay much, jobs people looked down on. But I never stopped learning. I read books, listened to people, and practiced languages whenever I could. I learned because I wanted to survive, to grow, and to become more than what the world expected of me." Richard listened, struck by the honesty and humility in Samuel's voice. He realized that this man, whom he had mocked, had faced struggles and hardships that he himself could not even imagine. And yet, Samuel had turned those struggles into strength, honing his mind quietly while the world ignored him. Samuel continued, "I've always believed that knowledge is the greatest gift. You don't need a title, a suit, or recognition to learn. You just need patience, determination, and belief in yourself. That's how I came to speak 9 languages, sir, not to impress anyone, but to survive and grow." The CEO felt a lump in his throat. He had lived a life of privilege, of power and recognition, but he had never faced the hardships Samuel had endured. And yet, here was a man, humble and quiet, showing a depth of character and wisdom far beyond his years. Richard realized that true greatness did not come from money or power, it came from perseverance, humility, and the courage to keep learning, even when the world ignored you. Employees had gathered outside, curious about the meeting. They could see Samuel and the CEO speaking, but they couldn't hear the words. Yet the atmosphere was thick with tension and respect. It was as if everyone knew something important was unfolding, a revelation that would change the office forever. After the meeting, Richard walked back to his office, silent and thoughtful. Samuel returned to his work quietly, sweeping the floors, moving as if nothing had happened. But the office now saw him differently. No one saw him as just a janitor. They saw a man who had overcome hardship, who had cultivated extraordinary skills in silence, and who had taught a lesson in humility and patience without ever intending to. Richard, for the first time, felt a deep respect for someone he had once dismissed. He understood that talent and worth were not always visible on the surface. And he knew that Samuel's story was not just about languages or intelligence, it was about resilience, courage, and the quiet power of a determined mind. That evening, as the sun set behind the tall buildings, casting long shadows on the polished floors, the office seemed to glow with a new energy. Employees whispered and shared glances filled with inspiration. Samuel continued his work quietly, unaware of the effect he had on everyone around him. And Richard, standing by the window, realized that the janitor had given him more than just help with clients, he had given him a lesson he would never forget. The following days passed with a quiet shift in the office. Employees went about their work, but the energy had changed. Whispers about Samuel circulated, mixed with admiration and curiosity. Even the CEO, Richard Blackwell, found it impossible to ignore the janitor's presence. His mind kept returning to the man he had once mocked, the man who had spoken 9 languages with ease and had faced life's struggles with quiet dignity. Richard began to notice the little things Samuel did, the way he solved minor problems without anyone asking, the patience he showed while teaching interns small tricks of the office, and the calm, reassuring presence he carried wherever he went. Each action reminded Richard that talent and value were not measured by titles or appearances. One afternoon, Richard stood in his office, staring out of the window. The sunlight reflected off the skyscrapers, but his mind was elsewhere. He replayed the past week in his head, the mockery, the disbelief, the shock of seeing Samuel speak fluently in multiple languages, and finally, the story of Samuel's life and struggles. The CEO felt a heaviness he had never known before. Pride, arrogance, and self-importance, all of it seemed meaningless in comparison to the quiet power Samuel had displayed. Unable to bear it any longer, Richard decided he needed to act. He called Samuel to his office. The janitor entered silently, bowing his head slightly in respect. Richard motioned for him to sit, though Samuel remained standing, ever humble. "Samuel," Richard began, his voice low and slightly hesitant, "I need to apologize, for mocking you, for underestimating you, and for thinking of you as less than you are. I see now. I was wrong." Samuel smiled faintly. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot. But you don't need to apologize. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them." Richard leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had been a man used to power, control, and respect, but this janitor had taught him humility. I want to change, Samuel. I want to treat people differently, to see the value in everyone. You've opened my eyes." The words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. Samuel nodded quietly. It takes time, sir. Change doesn't happen overnight. But every small step matters. That evening, as employees left the office, they noticed a new atmosphere. The CEO was no longer the unapproachable figure of arrogance. Something had shifted. Richard's demeanor was softer, more thoughtful. People whispered quietly about the change, wondering what had caused it. They couldn't see Samuel, who moved through the office calmly, yet they could feel the effect he had on everyone around him. Richard stayed behind, reflecting on the lessons he had learned. For the first time, he understood the value of respect, humility, and the quiet power of knowledge. He had faced his own arrogance and realized that true leadership was not about control or fear, it was about recognizing talent and nurturing it, even when it came from the most unexpected places. Samuel returned to his work, sweeping the floors with the same silent dedication as always. He didn't seek recognition, but his presence had already changed the office. Richard watched him from his window, feeling a mix of respect and awe. The CEO had learned a lesson he would never forget, and Samuel had quietly proven that greatness often comes in the most unassuming forms. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the polished floors, there was a sense of hope and transformation in the air. The office had witnessed not just skill and talent, but the power of humility, patience, and courage, the quiet strength that could change lives, even those of the most powerful. The morning sunlight spilled across the office, catching the polished floors in golden streaks. Employees moved quietly, aware that today felt different. Whispers circulated, questions lingered. Will the CEO finally acknowledge Samuel? Will he see what we've all seen? The tension in the air was almost tangible. Richard Blackwell, the CEO, walked into the office with a rare sense of purpose. Gone was the usual sharpness and arrogance in his stride. Today, he carried a quiet determination. He had reflected on the lessons Samuel had taught him, the humility, patience, and hidden brilliance that had transformed the way he viewed the world. Today, he would act. The employees gathered in the main hall, sensing something was about to happen. Samuel moved through the crowd quietly, doing his usual work with calm precision. His head bowed slightly, unaware that all eyes were on him, and unaware that today would be a turning point in his life. Richard cleared his throat, his voice carrying authority yet tempered with sincerity. "Everyone, I want to say something," he began. Conversations faded into silence. All eyes turned toward him, but soon, the gaze followed the janitor. "There is someone among us who has shown talent, patience, and dedication beyond anything I've ever witnessed," he said. His eyes locked on Samuel, who looked up in quiet surprise. "You may know him as our janitor, someone who sweeps floors and keeps the office clean," Richard continued. "But he is so much more. He has solved problems that I could not, handled important clients in multiple languages, and done it all with humility and grace. Samuel, you have taught me, and all of us, an important lesson about respect, patience, and recognizing talent wherever it exists." Employees gasped softly, some whispering to each other, others holding back applause. Samuel's face remained calm, but a hint of emotion flickered in his eyes. He had never sought recognition, never asked for praise, and yet the acknowledgement from the CEO carried a weight he could not ignore. Richard stepped closer. "I want to thank you publicly for all you have done. You are an example of true skill and character. Today, I hope everyone here remembers that greatness can come from anyone, anywhere, and sometimes it's hidden in the most unexpected places." A wave of admiration and respect swept through the office. Employees clapped quietly at first, then more openly, some standing to show their appreciation. Samuel nodded humbly, accepting the recognition without boastfulness. The room seemed to glow with a new energy, a mix of inspiration, respect, and disbelief. Richard continued, his voice softer now, filled with genuine emotion. "I have learned a lesson I will never forget. And I hope it inspires all of us to look beyond appearances, to value dedication and talent, and to remember that humility is often the true sign of greatness." Samuel returned to his work quietly, but the atmosphere had changed forever. He was no longer invisible. He had earned the respect of everyone in the office, and more importantly, he had earned the respect of the CEO. That day, employees left with a new perspective, inspired by Samuel's calm brilliance and the CEO's transformation. Richard, too, stayed longer than usual, reflecting on the lessons he had learned. He had been reminded that leadership was not about fear, power, or arrogance, it was about recognizing, valuing, and uplifting those around you. As the office emptied, Samuel continued moving through the hallways, quietly performing his tasks. But now, with every step, he carried a silent acknowledgement of his own worth, a quiet confidence that did not seek approval but had earned it in abundance. And for Richard, standing by the office window, the lesson was clear: the greatest discoveries often come from the most unexpected people, and true respect is earned, not assumed. The office was quiet in the late afternoon, sunlight streaming through the tall windows and casting long shadows across the polished floors. Samuel moved through the hallways as he always did, his mop gliding smoothly, his head slightly bowed, carrying the same calm dignity that had always been his hallmark. Yet everything had changed. He was no longer invisible, no longer just the janitor. Today, he had earned something far greater: respect. Richard Blackwell, the CEO, sat in his office staring out the window, reflecting on the past week. The lessons Samuel had quietly taught him, the power of patience, humility, and perseverance, resonated deeply. He had mocked, underestimated, and dismissed Samuel, only to realize that true greatness often hides where we least expect it. For Richard, the transformation was profound. He understood now that leadership was not about asserting dominance or demanding fear, it was about recognizing talent, valuing people, and nurturing those who might otherwise go unnoticed. Across the office, employees whispered among themselves, sharing stories of Samuel's hidden brilliance. Some smiled at memories of his calm composure during tense meetings, while others marveled at his mastery of languages. They had learned something invaluable: to look beyond appearances, to respect diligence, and to remember that extraordinary people often walk quietly among us. Samuel continued his work without pause, sweeping floors with the same quiet precision, but there was a new energy surrounding him. He carried himself with unspoken confidence, not prideful, but aware of the impact he had made. Every glance from an employee, every nod of acknowledgement, reminded him that his patience, hard work, and humility had been seen and valued. Richard called him into the office one final time. "Samuel," he said, his tone filled with sincere admiration, "you've taught me lessons that I will carry for the rest of my life. Your dedication, intelligence, and calm strength have changed the way I see the world, and the way I see people." Samuel nodded quietly, a faint smile crossing his face. "Thank you, sir. I never expected recognition. I just tried to do my best every day." "That's what makes you extraordinary," Richard replied. "Not the languages, not the skills, but the patience, humility, and heart behind it all." As Samuel returned to his work, Richard remained at the window, watching him move gracefully through the office. The CEO realized that true power and greatness were not measured by status or wealth, but by the courage to persevere, the ability to remain humble, and the willingness to help others without expectation. Samuel had quietly embodied all of these qualities, and in doing so, had changed not just the office, but Richard himself. By evening, the office was emptying. The lights dimmed, leaving golden streaks of sunlight stretching across the floors. Employees left with a newfound respect for Samuel and a deeper understanding of humility and talent. The story of the janitor who spoke 9 languages spread quickly through the office, inspiring everyone to see the world differently. Samuel continued his routine, calm and silent, yet now carrying the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. He had faced life's challenges, honed his skills in secret, and emerged not seeking fame, but leaving a legacy of inspiration and respect. And Richard, the CEO, had learned a lesson he would never forget: never judge someone by their role, appearance, or the simplicity of their work. True greatness often walks quietly among us, waiting to be seen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, warm shadows across the office, one truth lingered in the hearts of all who had witnessed the events: patience, humility, and quiet strength are the most powerful forces of all, and sometimes, the smallest person in the room can teach the greatest lessons.